once for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. Hello, lovely listeners. Remember us? Yes, we are still alive and we're finally back. Again, and I feel like we've said that far too many times recently. This year has certainly been a little bit testing so far. But you're not getting rid of us that easily. Are you listening, universe? And although it probably looked like we had simply vanished off the face of the earth, we've really managed to cram in lots of wonderful spooky stuff since the last episode. We've visited 2 ruined castles, a ghost town, driven right across the country to find some haunted woods, all of which we'll be sharing with you in the very near future. But for now, Fitz, what do we have coming up on today's episode?
Well, first up, we want to have a bit of a catch-up about some of the spooky activity here at KOFY HQ, and play you a possible EVP caught during one of our patron Zooms. Then we have a haunted pub in Canterbury, and one of Lil's favourite topics, spooky dolls, on the paranormal radar. We have listener stories from Mike, Kate and Bob, and we head over to Holywell, St Ives, to bring you a curious tale 2 years in the making, of the ghost that never was, and why you should always go back for ice cream. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say welcome and a huge thank you to our latest patrons.
Arthur Graham,
Catherine,
Sophie H,
Emily Rigby,
Anna Maria,
Caroline Carruthers,
and Liz Foster for upping her pledge.
And to Ryan and Annie for making one-off donations through KOFY.
And a big welcome back to Andrew, one of our founding patrons. That makes me so happy. Andrew, we missed you. And as always, thank you so much to all of our patrons, Repod and KOFY supporters, old and new. It means the world to us that you choose to support us in continuing on this weird and wonderful exploration of all things spooky and strange. We absolutely love sharing it with you guys, but we couldn't do it without you. And we especially want to thank you all for your support over the last couple of months, and well, most of this year really, to be honest, whilst we've been struggling with various things and our schedule has been all over the place. We're unendingly grateful for your patience and continued support.
We're really looking forward to giving you a tour of the new studio when it's done, so you can see what your support is actually going towards. And you can also keep up to date on the studio build on our Discord channel, which you have access to as patrons. We've also been mentioning for a while that we'll sit down and record a little video catch-up about everything that's been going on for all of our listeners as well as our patrons, and that'll be coming out fairly soon after this episode. And as a little extra, we'll be including some footage from our most recent trip to the haunted location featured in this episode, the Ferryboat Inn.
Now, having just been talking about patrons, let's get into our first topic of the episode, because it was one of our amazing patrons who alerted us to the fact that we may have unwittingly caught an EVP right in our living room.
For those of you who aren't aware, we host Zoom chats with our patrons, usually after we've released an episode, where we talk about the locations we've visited and the interesting stories that might not have made it into the final cut, weird stuff that's happened to us in general, and other fun stuff. Not long after I'd published the recording of the last Zoom chat, one of our patrons, Selena, got in touch to say that she thought she heard something that might be an EVP about half an hour in. I've clipped the section in question. Have a listen and see what you think.
But then what happened later was even more interesting, because literally about we were surprised because we haven't had any activity for ages, and because it was a letterbox and it's kind of who we call Jack's almost like his favourite trick. We just kind of said like, "Oh, hello, Jack. It's been a while since you've made any noise around here." But about 10-15 minutes later, we had a fire in the living room.
So that was the clip. You can hear me talking a little bit first, and then you can hear a voice coming over the top of me. And then about 6 seconds later, as I continue talking, you can hear that same voice come through again, or at least that's what it sounds like. I don't want to tell you yet what we think it says because I don't want to give you any bias. So have a listen to it a couple more times, and then we'll come back and talk about what we think it says and why that's interesting.
But then what happened later was even more interesting, because literally about we were surprised because we haven't had any activity for ages, and because it was a letterbox and it's kind of who we call Jack's was like his favourite trick. We just kind of said like, "Oh, hello, Jack. It's been a while since you've made any noise around here." But about 10-15 minutes later, we had a fire in the living room. But then what happened later was even more interesting, because literally about we were surprised because we haven't had any activity for ages, and because it was a letterbox and it's kind of who we call Jack's, was like his favourite trick. We just kind of said like, "Oh, hello, Jack. It's been a while since you've made any noise around here." But about 10-15 minutes later, we had a fire in the living room.
So, what do you think? Well, Selena thought it was a voice saying Jack, which was quite compelling considering what it was we were talking about at the time. Unfortunately, the day we got the email, I had a terrible earache, which in fact I'm still recovering from, so I couldn't wear headphones and couldn't really investigate much further. So I did the next best thing and found someone with healthier ears. I deliberately didn't tell Lil what Selena believed was being said, and simply told her to listen to the recording at a specific time. She immediately responded with,
"It says Jack. I heard exactly the same thing as Selena. The second I heard it, it was so clear to me. And then afterwards, it sounds like the voice is saying either not me or was me. But I mean, that's just what it sounds like to me. I know that not everybody heard a voice that we played it to."
No, this is the thing. So some people, and it was about a 50-50 split of the people we sent it to. We've got some friends in the paranormal and a few other people we asked to sort of check. And about half of them came back without being prompted and "It says Jack."
Yep.
And the other half just said, what, the bang or the weird noise.
Yeah.
But it was just so bizarre that it was such a definite split.
The other thing you've got to bear in mind, obviously the people that we sent it to weren't at the meeting. Because we were at the meeting, we could see everybody on screen. Well, not everybody, because some people had their cameras turned off, which is, completely fine. I'm pretty sure the people that had their cameras off were, for the most part, muted at that point. And also, normally on a Zoom call, if somebody starts speaking over the top of the person speaking, the main audio kind of ducks out a bit. And that didn't happen here, which would imply that it was something in our room. The people that were on camera, we could rewatch the video and nobody was even moving, let alone speaking. So it was probably more odd to us having been there at the time, because we knew we weren't moving. We could see nobody else was moving. Pretty much everybody else was muted. There was nothing else really happening, and you didn't get that ducking effect that you normally get on Zoom when somebody starts to speak over the top of you. So it does seem like it was something that probably came through our microphone, and we can't find another reason for that. But just to give you a little bit more context as well about why it's interesting that we're hearing Jack. I mean, you can hear that that's what I'm saying in the clip. The reason for that is because we had something very strange happen that afternoon while we were setting up for the Zoom meeting. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that we have a resident ghost and we call him Jack. I won't get into that now because it's quite long-winded, but if you listen back through the episodes, you'll find lots of mentions of our ghost Jack. And one of his favourite tricks is knocking on our letterbox. It happens quite a lot, and it's usually quite friendly and doesn't tend to go on for very long. It's almost just like a brief "hello, I'm here," checking in kind of thing. But that day it happened, and it went on for a really long time.
Yeah, so normally you might be forgiven for thinking it's just the letterbox flapping closed after being stuck up or something. It tends to just fluff, fluff. But it's been going on so long, and we've seen it happen at my parents' house and various other things. It's kind of a tradition now. Whereas this one was more than that.
It was long,
persistent. It was repeated.
It was like somebody was knocking at the door, and we did think for a second that somebody was knocking at the door, except that
I can see the front door from where I was sitting, and there was nobody at the door. We even jumped up and had a look just in case there was, I don't know, a tiny person at the door knocking at, or
child
something.
hiding.
But no, there was nobody at the door. There was nobody up and down the street.
No, and there was no wind, because that's the other thing we always check for whenever it happens, is we always go out and check if there's any wind, because of course...
Not that it even does it when there's a gale. I think it did once.
I think maybe when we had like 100 mile an hour winds.
Yeah, we had like the windiest day that we've ever had since we lived here, and it just went... Flu, flu.
Yeah, it was nothing like what we normally get at all. So, but even so, we always check to just, be on the safe side. there was just not a breath of wind. There was nothing. And like I said, it was just so obvious. It was so pointed.
Mm-hmm.
So because it was strange and a bit out of the ordinary, we sat and discussed it for a while, in that we had been intending to go off and do other things, but we sat and discussed it, and it basically detained us in that room for longer than we had intended.
Yes, which was a good thing, because all of a sudden I'm sat there and I can smell burning, and I turn round and there was a fire next to me. One of my batteries had managed to touch a key ring or something and set the rubber on fire on the key ring. Like, it was one of those things that's like a 1 in 1,000 chance of ever happening. But yeah, there was basically...
But it had happened.
Yes,
there was a plume of smoke.
There was smoke, there was fire, and luckily I was right there, so I managed to just stop it immediately before it became a bigger issue.
But if we hadn't, if we'd have gone off and done whatever we were going to do, and we hadn't have been sitting there looking at each other going, what on earth was that at the door? What's going on? Then that would have taken... I mean, we have a smoke alarm, but it would have taken longer than that.
And this was right next to the curtains as well. They could have gone up, and it could have been very, very bad. It
could have been really bad, yeah.
But fortunately, like I say, we stopped. I mean, we have made additional security precautions since then, so that it can't happen again, which is a good thing. But yeah, it was quite scary at the time. That it could have been a lot worse than it was.
Literally, if we hadn't have been sitting right next to it, and been able to put it out immediately, it could have got quite bad. Yeah. So it shook us up, but we were so grateful that whatever had happened at the front door had happened, because it meant that we were there to deal with it immediately. And of course, that we cannot help but for all of that to bring a lot more meaning to this potential EVP.
But what do you think? We're interested to hear what you think either way. We'll certainly be doing some more investigations at home in future, though, to see if we can catch it again.
But for now, Fitz, I believe you have a couple of stories for me today on the Paranormal Radar.
I do.
And one of them I'm not going to like very much.
No. Our first Paranormal Radar story comes from a haunted pub in Kent. The Maiden's Head pub is believed to be over 700 years old and is possibly the oldest pub in Canterbury. It appears from the story that the activity began when the landlord carried out some renovations, converting the upper floors into guest rooms. Even before the work was completed, the activity began, with one of the builders complaining that it didn't feel comfortable in the area and that something wasn't right. After the rooms were completed, the activity began to escalate, and specifically in one particular room, Room 4. The cleaner of the pub commented that the room is often freezing cold even on the hottest of days, and that it feels strange. Guests have had even stranger experiences, with one reporting that a glass in the room exploded, which, if you've ever worked in a bar or pub, you might know it's not entirely out of the ordinary. But another reported that a glass had flown across the room and been shattered against the wall, which definitely is more unusual. But it isn't just glasses that the mischief-making spirit likes to mess with. Apparently, they also have a bit of a thing for car keys. 2 different guests who'd stayed in room 4 both reported that their car keys had gone missing from within the locked room. Even with all of this activity, the landlord remains cautiously sceptical, saying, "Something's not right, but I haven't experienced it." Possibly not that sceptical though, as he follows up with the statement by adding that if he does experience something, he'll probably sell the place quite quickly. I think this may be another location that we have to add to our list of places to visit. We'll just have to make sure that we book room 4 and not to leave the car keys to the coffee-mobile in there.
I think that definitely needs to go on the list of places for us to visit. See, that's the kind of Paranormal Radar story I enjoy. This next one, however... Now, if you're new here, dear listeners, you need to know that I have a mortal fear of creepy dolls. It's a recurring theme and a bit of a running joke in the coffee community, so even though this story isn't technically paranormal, we couldn't resist sharing this particularly weird and wonderful tale.
So our second paranormal radar story comes from the beaches along the Gulf Coast of Texas, where something unusual keeps washing up on shore. Researchers at Mission Aransas National Estuarine Research Reserve frequently walk the beach between Padre Island and Matagorda Island in southeastern Texas, surveying the coastal ecosystem and recording the sea and bird life that they find. But recently they've also been encountering some particularly disturbing human-made waste. The pollution of our seas and oceans is bad enough on its own, but what's been washing up on these beaches is even worse. Creepy-looking dolls. I'm not talking about a shipment of dolls that's been washed overboard like the Friendly Floaties, and if you're unfamiliar with the Friendly Floaties, it's an interesting story in its own right. In 1992, a shipment of 29,000 rubber ducks was spilled from a container transport ship, and they've been washing up around the globe for 30 years now. Scientists have even been using them to study and model ocean currents. The dolls making landfall in Texas, however, do not appear to be from a single shipment, as they are all different shapes, sizes, ages and types. In fact, the one that brought the initial media attention was in fact an adult companionship doll's head. But there were plenty more to follow, and the variety seemed to be endless. There were gnomes, Santas, disembodied heads, dolls with mismatched bodies and heads, and there's even one so badly discoloured that it looks like the Mountain after he was resurrected in Game of Thrones. All of them encrusted with barnacles, mottled with seaweed growth, sea creatures growing out of empty eye sockets, literally looking like something from a horror film. And it isn't just one or two either. The researchers are collecting bucketfuls of these creepy dolls. When asked why the dolls are washing up there, the researchers blamed the loop current around Mexico and the east coast of Florida that pushes waste towards the Texas coast. But for me, they're kind of missing the point. I get that the current is delivering waste there, but why is the waste dolls? Where are they coming from? Bizarrely, when the researchers shared that these dolls were washing up, they began getting interest from people wanting to buy them, and seeing a way to further fund their research, Mission Aransas obliged. It's at this point of the story that John Oliver, host of Last Week Tonight, got involved. Hearing about both the dolls and the sale of them to raise funds, the show stepped in to buy all of the remaining dolls in exchange for a generous donation towards their conservation research. And the reason he wanted to buy the dolls was simple. He shares Lil's opinion of these creepy dolls, that they were evil and that they had to be destroyed. So, are we safe now from the creepy doll menace? Well, they haven't quite gone yet. John is currently trying to find a good way to thoroughly destroy the creepy menace, whilst also safely recycling them. And of course there are also a few still out there in the wild, as other people had bought some before he stepped in. But even after Last Week Tonight bought the remainder, it's likely only a temporary reprieve, as I have no doubt that they will continue to crawl from the ocean's depths to beach themselves on the Texas coast for some time to come. And as a bit of a public service announcement, whilst we would normally say not to take things from locations, in this case, if you do spot waste lying about, especially plastic waste, do pick it up, take it home and recycle it. But if that plastic rubbish happens to be a creepy looking doll, maybe take it straight to a public recycling point rather than your home recycling, just to be on the safe side. As usual, the links to the story will be in the show notes on the website, but I will reiterate these things are the stuff of nightmare, so do think twice before you click that link.
Well, thank you for that fresh batch of nightmares. Honestly, you should have seen him reading that. He was reading it with such relish and looking me directly in the eye. Why did people want to buy them? That's my question. Why dolls, and why did people want to buy them?
I must admit, when I first saw that on Last Week Tonight, I was like, I kind of want one. It would be really good in KOFY HQ. And if you misbehave, I'll be like, here comes the creepy doll.
Oh, we're not having one of those.
They were pretty scary. But yeah, like I said, where are they coming from? I get that rubbish washes up there, but why so many dolls?
It's probably something really basic, like the construction of a doll, because they're hollow, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
It's possibly just that they are more likely to get caught in the current because they're very buoyant, or they're just crawling up from the deeps to get us.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much, basically.
Yeah. It's a creepy army of dolls.
Creepy doll invasion. Well, that's quite enough nightmare fuel for one day, thank you. Let's calm down a bit with some nice ghost stories. And the first story of today's episode is from Mike.
I'm writing to tell you about my grandfather and how my family feels he continues to communicate with us since his passing in 1990. I have 3 stories that show his affinity for communicating through timepieces. My grandpa Jimmy was a patriarch in the best sense of the word, a larger-than-life guy. He was a first-generation American born to Italians who escaped the slums and tenements of New York City, survived the Great Depression, opened businesses, built families, and refused to stay down. His sudden death at age 54 truly left a crater-sized hole in the family. Before Grandpa Jimmy's passing, my grandmother was doing some cleaning out. She found an old watch and was about to toss it, but Grandpa Jimmy stopped her, saying, "Don't, you'll need this someday." She threw it into a shoebox and never gave it a second thought. Then fast forward to 2001, my aunt, his daughter, gives birth to my cousin after only 25 weeks of pregnancy, giving him just a 10% chance of survival. My new cousin's whisked away from the family and placed on life support, but after some time he was finally cleared for visitors. For reasons unknown, during the first permitted visiting hours at the hospital, my grandmother dropped Grandpa Jimmy's broken watch into my cousin's incubator. The next day, our family returned for visiting hours, and one of the nurses said, "You scared us. We didn't know you'd put a watch in there, and we couldn't figure out what the tick-ticking noise was coming from." We were surprised, but sure enough, we all verified that the watch was ticking away next to my sleeping 1-pound cousin. A watch that had been dead for more than 20 years, ticked away day and night for the duration of my cousin's 4-month stay in the hospital. As soon as he was released from hospital, the watch stopped working. It remains in my family. We never know when we'll need it again. As for my cousin, he beat the odds by learning to walk, which is something the doctor said would never happen, and graduated high school recently. My second story relates to a wall clock that my grandpa Jimmy received when he reached 25 years of service at his job. That clock stayed on the wall in their home until my grandmother's passing in 2018. As the eldest grandchild, I inherited it, and when I moved into a new house in 2021, I put the clock in my guest bedroom because I thought it looked good there. Grandpa Jimmy appears to have disagreed, because that clock chimed non-stop until I moved it several times, finally moving it into the living room. I had to laugh because it was a silly mistake on my part. A quiet bedroom was not the place for Grandpa Jimmy. He needed to be in the main living area where all the fun takes place. My mother, aunt and uncle, his 3 children, have all reported their watches stopping at or near the exact moment that they made big decisions, like deciding to retire, deciding to change jobs, or making big financial decisions. They feel it was his way of letting them know he's still there for them, since they were all so young when he passed away. The same thing happened to me when I submitted the paperwork to open my own immigration law office. Grandpa Jimmy was taken from us too soon, but we have no doubt he's still watching. Pun obviously and shamelessly intended over his family.
Thank you so much to Mike for sharing those experiences with us. And those stories are amazing and quite familiar because, Fitch, you've had family experiences that have been very similar.
Yes, I think that's why he got in touch to share those stories, because they were so similar to some of the stuff that I've shared before that my mum's experienced. Almost word for word in many cases. Her watch stopped when my grandfather died, and she had a carriage clock from him that used to stay in the living room, and whenever she was feeling low, there were times that she went into the room in the middle of the night and this clock that hadn't worked for years suddenly started working again. And interestingly, he was also a Jim.
Oh, really?
Yes.
But what is it about watches and clocks, though? I can understand a watch because it's something you wear on your... I mean, I don't wear a watch these days, but when I did, I never took it off. It was on me 24/7 pretty much, so... You've got that prolonged contact, you've got that connection to a person, but a clock, you don't carry it around with you.
Like wall clocks and carriage clocks and things, no, it's just, they're sort of static. So I don't know, it's very strange.
I mean, obviously there'd be quite an emotional sort of attachment possibly, but maybe it's something to do with how it works, how it keeps time. I mean, some clocks and watches have quartz crystals in them to maintain, even time so they don't go out of time. And I think that produces like a little electric current, but I don't know. It's a mystery, but there does seem to be something about clocks and watches and timepieces. It also reminds me of when we visited Colchester Museum and they had that room with all the clocks in it. It was just like a museum room full of clocks. And there was a really strong, strange atmosphere there. And I had a bit of an experience. And again, it was all clocks. It's just something about timepieces, I guess.
Makes me wonder if like in 50 or 100 years time somebody will be like, oh, you'll take this old mobile phone that hasn't worked in 50 years and it's like suddenly started working.
Maybe.
So thank you again to Mike for sharing that story. And now it's time for tea and biscuits. Oh, and an apparition in our next story from Kate.
I'd enjoyed temping for some time after university as it allowed me to work in several different sectors. One particular assignment saw me placed in a company in the highly prestigious area of London, namely Grosvenor Street. The building from the Georgian era oozed historical grandeur from top to bottom and inside and out. Its ornate pillar frontage, sweeping staircase, marble flooring and historical art on its walls made for a grand appearance and feel. Life, for many of us, is made up of milestones. For some, these might include events such as getting married, bringing a baby into the world, being offered a dream job, buying your first home, or travelling the world. Whilst I'm happy to say I've achieved many of the above, one of the most influencing experiences I've ever had was in this house when I was 24 years old. This encounter was a milestone at that time, for it framed my views on life and death, before and after, and everything in between. This luxurious building housed only a small number of us. We were the security guard, 4 administration staff, and a chef for important events that took place on the premises. Every morning at 11 a.m, we took turns making tea, coffee and biscuits for one another, and on this particular morning, it was my task to honour. I walked down the spiral staircase into the lower quarters of the house, along the short passageway, and into the basement kitchen, just like I did every time. Everything felt perfectly normal. I had no reason to think otherwise, as I stood in the corner by the kettle, concentrating on the menial task of repeating in my mind who took sugar and who didn't. With my back to the door, I suddenly felt the atmosphere in the room change. My whole body shivered in an instant, and the feeling that I was most definitely not alone washed over me like a tidal wave. It hung on thick and fast. I was rooted to the spot with fear. I intuitively knew that I had to turn around and face what or who was also sharing my space in the kitchen. There in front of me, and to my utter astonishment, stood a man staring back at me with such intensity I felt like his eyes were boring into my soul. Our eyes locked. I remember time wasn't a concept at this stage. I could have been standing there for seconds or minutes. This I will never know. But as soon as I had acknowledged his appearance with my physical eyes, my spiritual ones kicked in, as I realised he was not from our world. My second thought was, how on earth was I going to get out of the room, given that he was standing in the doorway of the only entrance and exit? He was around 5'6" tall and of solid form. His skin was grey, like a heavy smoker's, and his lips were thin and pursed. His eyes were black, but not frightening. I could see that he was predominantly bald, with small patches of grey hair visible only on the sides of his head. His attire was simple, a black coat accompanied by a whiter-than-white shirt. Due to the island in the middle of the kitchen, his lower body was obscured from view, but something in my mind told me that the coat was long. I got the feeling he was from the era of the house by his clothing. His arms remained down by his sides the whole time we were looking at one another. The temperature did not change, but there was no sound in the room. It was as if time stood still. He continued to stare at me with a blank expression, and he did not move. I felt less and less scared as the situation unfolded. This certainly wasn't my first encounter with the paranormal, but it didn't feel right to speak. I felt as if he would go if I made a sound. I was intrigued, and I wanted him to try and communicate with me. And then, in a flash, he vanished in front of me, and I was left standing, staring at the white wall of the passageway where he'd been only moments earlier. What did he want? What was he trying to say to me? Now, with the doorway empty once again, and with newfound bravery, I remember vividly walking, quite calmly, up the spiral staircase back to the reception area where our security guard was stationed. My mind was racing in 1,000 different directions and with 1,000,000 different questions. Who or what did I see? Had I walked into a different time zone of the past? Had he lived in the house before or worked there? Had he appeared to me for a reason? Was there a message? Why me? The notion that spirits appear only in a 12th century castle in the dead of night during a dramatic thunderstorm quickly left my mind, as I now had confirmation that this was not true. Here I was at work, making tea at 11 a.m. I somehow reached the top of the stairs and was greeted by our security guard. He paused and looked at me. I joke you not when I tell you that he said, "Kate, are you okay? You look like you've just seen a ghost." I responded, "I think I have," as I detailed my experience, the words falling out of my mouth. Due to the high profile of some of the guests in the building, he was forced to conduct a full search of the house. After half an hour, he returned to tell us that he'd found no one inside the house of the description I'd outlined of the man in the kitchen. I remained working there for months afterwards, but I never saw him again. The subject got put in the forget about it folder, and that was that for everybody working there, bar me. It was an experience I've never forgotten. I can still see his face in my mind's eye as if I'd met him yesterday. I often wonder why he only appeared to me, and on only one occasion. When I think of him, I feel privileged that he felt comfortable in presenting himself to me, even if it was just once.
And thank you again to Kate for sharing that story. I think I have almost identical questions to all the ones you've asked in your story.
Yeah.
And basically you've covered everything that I'm intrigued about in that. Did he work there? Did he live there? When was he from? What does he want? Did he have a message? I want to know.
And it reminded me of the experience that I had in our very haunted house that we first lived in together, when she said about the locking eyes. Because that's something that doesn't happen very often. When you see apparitions, it's more of a rarity, I think. And it's something that's only happened to me, I think, once. Just that one time where I saw an apparition and they saw me right back and our eyes locked. And it's quite profound when that happens. So no wonder that it stayed with you, Kate. And I had the same questions in that moment as well. Why me? And that only happened once as well. Why me? Why only that once? What happened kind of thing. But it's absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you'd ever been able to look into the history of the house and possibly see who lived there, although I suppose there wouldn't necessarily be photographs. I mean, how amazing would that be?
Yeah, I was literally just going to say, and then we dug behind the fireplace and found a photo album with the picture, and it was the man that I saw. It's like, that's the kind of story I was almost expecting it to be.
It may one day turn into that. You never know. You never know. And thank you again so much to Kate for sharing your experience with us. I love that one. That was absolutely fascinating. Well, now we're moving on to our last listener story of the episode, and we're rounding off the day with something a little bit different. This story is from Bob.
I've had a few strange things happen to me during my years, but the first one I remember was the visit from two goblins. Now, I know you're going to say, oh, you were only a kid, or you must have been semi-awake and still dreaming, but this has stayed with me for more than 50 years, and I can still see these creatures in my mind's eye, as clear as when it first happened. I was about 5 or 6 at the time, and we lived in a Victorian terraced house, what we call here in England a 2 up, 2 down, which is basically 2 bedrooms above 2 downstairs rooms, a front parlour for best and family visits, and the main living, dining and family room. The only addition was a single-storey kitchen and wash house tacked onto the back, and the outside toilet was out back of that. There must have been, and probably still are, many thousands just like it up and down the country. Not at all spooky from what I remember. As we were both very young, my older sister and I shared the back bedroom, with our parents having the front one. My bed was in the corner furthest from and parallel to the rear-facing window, with my sister's bed just the other side of our shared bedside table, and between that and the bedroom door. My habit was to sleep with my back to the wall, so I could see the whole room, pretty much in one view. On the night in question, I awoke to see what I still vividly remember as an imp, goblin or gargoyle-type figure clinging to the wall near the ceiling, near the chimney stack, and heading toward the diagonally far corner. As most kids would do, I pulled the bedclothes over my head and pretended to be asleep, while still unable to take my eyes off this thing through the tiny gap I'd left. He could have been no bigger than 10 inches tall, and moved in a jerky manner, like skitter, stop, look around, repeat. Maybe moving a few inches in one movement, and seemed to have no difficulty supporting himself by clinging to the wallpaper with his claws. I remember thinking that it looked as if it were lit by moonlight from the window, but we had curtains that were always drawn closed at night. Greyish with sharply defined detail, its skin was like one of those sphinx cats, although I never even knew they existed at the time. Like stretched over its bones, smooth but supple and slightly baggy at the same time. It had no wings that I could see, and had big pointed ears, large eyebrows and eyes. Just to say, we didn't go anywhere much beyond the end of the street at that age, apart from to school and back, along streets just like ours, and TV consisted of Watch with Mother which was not at all scary, so my known world was very small. I had very limited experience and couldn't have conjured it up from a memory. It's only been as I've got older that I've come to recognise the same things on church masonry and as modern garden ornaments. As it got nearer to the corner, and then around onto the window wall, I then noticed a second creature near the other side of the window from the first. This too was jerking its head around shiftily, as if on lookout for anything coming. Now, our windows were the old-fashioned sash-type ones, which were two-part and slid past each other in an up-down direction, with a rotary latch at the middle, which stopped either half from sliding up or down. As the two things met up on either side of the top frame, just under the curtain rail, it was then that I noticed the curtains were open. The second one pushed down on the top section of the window with its rear leg, and slid it down a few inches, wide enough for them to climb out. With one last scan over their shoulders at the room in general, they both climbed out and slid the window closed from the outside. Then they both disappeared from view, I supposed up and over the guttering and onto the roof. I lay awake for a long time, for fear that they would come back. But I must have dropped off back to sleep eventually. The next morning, I debated whether to mention what had happened to my parents, but chose to keep it to myself for fear of ridicule. I never thought to check on the window catch, as I was way too small to reach that high on the window anyway, and was always warned about climbing on things and the dangers of falling off furniture. So I just got on with kid's life and pushed it to the back of my mind, chalking it up to a bad dream. For many, many years I kept this to myself, but a couple of years back I was visiting my sister and recounted my experience during mutual reminiscences of our early childhood home to finally unburden myself of the secret. When I'd finished, she just said, "Oh yes, them," with the emphasis on them, as if she knew about them, but that they were something that shouldn't be talked about. She wouldn't go into any further detail or answer the questions that came into my head, and waved it away with a sudden change of subject. Whether or not she had seen the same things that same night, or had had her own experiences with them, is still unclear. I certainly never saw them again after that night, and our parents moved us all to another home across the other side of the city soon after. What they were, or why they were in our room that night, I will never know, but they were sneaking around for some reason. Perhaps my awakening put paid to their intentions and forced them to make a hasty exit. I do hope so. This all happened in the early 1960s, when the groundwork for Spaghetti Junction and Aston Expressway was being started. Those terraced houses were all compulsorily purchased and demolished, and whole neighbourhoods were wiped out to make way. Could all that upheaval trigger paranormal activity? Who knows?
And thank you so much to Bob for sharing that amazing experience with us. And yes, I completely think that the building of Spaghetti Junction is more than enough to kick off all sorts of paranormal activity. And I didn't realise that in building the junction, they had to rehome people, basically kick people out of their houses and then demolish those houses in order to make room for it. Now, we've talked so many times on this show about how house renovations can kick up paranormal activity. So imagine that scale when you're talking about a whole community of people being rehomed and those houses razed to the ground to build this monstrosity of a junction. And if you're not from the UK and you've never heard of Spaghetti Junction, it's just a mess of roads. They kind of go over one another, under one another, they swirl around underneath. the namesake is Spaghetti Junction because from an aerial view, it looks like you've picked up a fork full of roads and dumped them in a spaghetti bowl and they've just kind of splat it. That's what it looks like. So the upheaval of that building process, I can only imagine what kinds of bizarre activity that could potentially kick up. The other thing I wanted to point out was when Bob was explaining about how he just didn't have the formative experiences as a child of that age to be able to imagine this creature that he could recall in such vivid and particular detail. I mean, the one that really got me was when he was describing the creature's skin as like that of a Sphinx cat. Now, that's just not something that is so difficult to imagine unless you've seen it. And I just wanted to point it out because I recognise what he was saying about at that age, in that time, because obviously I'm older, I grew up in the 80s, we didn't have the internet, you didn't have iPads, we had like 3 TV channels, and the TV wasn't on a lot like it is these days. When I was growing up as a kid, there was like maybe one programme a week that my mum put on for me and I watched, and that was it. Other than that, the input, the sort of incidental learning that I had was from my mum. You know, she was aware of everything that I learned, books that she read to me. This is before I went to school, the one TV program we watched together every week. So if there was something that I knew about, it had come from basically within the household. That's something that's quite difficult, I think, to imagine today for later generations that have grown up with lots of TV channels, the internet and iPads, and there's kind of information coming in left, right and centre from a very young age. So it can be quite difficult to think, well, you know, he could have thought, he could have seen something, he could have seen a creature that looked like that and nobody really knew about it. But I just want to point out how much more unlikely that was in that time period.
I think the most interesting point for me, and it happens on quite a few of these stories, you get to the end of blah, 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 and then it's, and then I spoke to my sister and she saw exactly the same thing, even though we'd never talked about it. It's just, that's so weird.
That takes it to another level, doesn't it? And it would be so easy to think, oh, you know, childhood imagination, and you know, and Bob says so himself.
Yeah.
But when your sister turns around and goes, oh them.
Yes, exactly.
That's a different kettle of fish entirely at that point, isn't it? And it was interesting that she didn't want to talk about them. I mean, not completely unusual in any paranormal field, but I do feel like that happens more often when it's a paranormal occurrence that doesn't fit into a sort of a neat box.
Mm-hmm.
And we find that a lot. It's, you know, in Britain particularly, most people are actually quite willing to talk about ghost stories. They're very much, especially for our generation and above our generation, they're very much part of our culture. They're kind of just intertwined. People don't really bat an eyelid. But when you start bringing up things like cryptids or aliens or goblins or anything that doesn't fit into the sort of neat umbrella term of ghost, people start to get a little bit squirrely. And it bothers me a little bit. We've talked about this before in just the fact that it's, of course, it's easier for us to use the word ghost. It makes it just easier to have a conversation because everybody knows what you mean. But the fact is, we don't know what ghosts are. We're just using it as a label to make things easier. When you actually drill down into all the different types of stories we've heard on the show and even the things that we've experienced, they've probably got less in common than they have in common. And there's so much crossover between what's sometimes considered to be different fields of the paranormal. Yeah. In my opinion, they could easily be all the same thing, or from the reversed perspective, what we call ghosts could all be different things. We basically just don't know what we're talking about.
No, it is funny, and we say this a lot. We get some cracking stories from people that are just, I don't believe in all that nonsense, but, and you get a cracking poltergeist story or something like that. But if you were to say, I saw Bigfoot at the side of the road, don't be silly.
Yeah, it's just more easily written off, isn't it? And I think it is just a case of labelling. People have become very comfortable with the label of ghosts. They've become very normalised, and they have been normalised in British culture for a very long time. But actually, if you go back a bit further, a bit sort of just before like Victorian era, goblins, fairies, cryptids, creatures, things that lived in the woods, skittery things, they were all completely normal as well. They've just literally fallen out of fashion, and all of a sudden people get a bit uncomfortable when you talk about them, so they fall out of popular culture. And really, they're just different aspects of the same thing we're talking about all the time. They're just different aspects of the paranormal, and they have been for a very, very long time.
So thank you again to Bob and everybody that shared stories with us this episode. And if you've had a paranormal experience, please do get in touch at knockonceforyes.com. Well, that was the end of today's listener stories, but now we're heading to the Old Ferryboat Inn in St Ives, Cambridgeshire, to a quaint little village named Holywell, as we share with you the curious tale of the ghost that never was, and why you should always go back for ice cream.
This episode has been a long time coming. The ghost story at the inn is quite famous, and the location only an hour or so away from us, so it popped up on our radar not long after we started the podcast. But we never quite got around to visiting, and in the early days we kept hitting a brick wall when we tried to look into the story. Of course, that was over 5 years ago, and since then so many more resources have become available online that stories once inaccessible to us can now be explored. But still, we didn't visit. I could never quite put my finger on what it was, but it didn't call to me until one day when I was researching another location entirely and happened to stumble upon an obituary of esteemed parapsychologist Tony Cornell. And what I read in that article cast a whole new light on the ghost of the Ferryboat Inn. We visited the old ferryboat in the Cambridgeshire village of Holywell for the first time not long after, and as soon as we did, the place took a strange hold of me, and the tale that once hadn't held my interest turned into a slight obsession. We ended up visiting multiple times over the last couple of years, sometimes even giving up an entirely different planned destination to divert there instead. I just couldn't seem to get this place out of my head. This is one story where nothing is quite as it seems, but after our most recent visit, I think I finally found what I was searching for, and it feels like the right time to tell this story at last. Nestled on a bend of the River Great Ouse, or maybe the River Great Ouse, depending on where you're from, sits a whitewashed inn with blackened timbers and a thatched roof. When we visit early one cool autumn morning before the sun has emerged from behind the shadowy tree line, mist rises eerily off the river, lending a white shroud to the gnarled willows that bow their heads at the water's edge. Our early start has paid off, and the place is deserted at this hour. The riverbank in front of the inn is empty of cars, and we find ourselves almost whispering as we pull up, unwilling to break the silence of the morning. Somewhat unsettlingly, a single dishevelled wooden chair sits in the middle of the otherwise immaculate and empty riverbank, looking out across the water as though placed there for the repose of an unseen watchman. It makes us feel rather like we're intruding on someone's lonely, silent vigil. At this hour, with the inn still sleeping, the Holywell riverfront is timeless. The road is sparsely dotted with chocolate box thatched cottages as it peels away from the line of the river to curve up towards the site of the 13th century church. In fact, the road circles all the way around and back on itself, creating a closed loop that still echoes the original plan of the Anglo-Saxon ring village that once stood on this land. We sit on the riverbank, clutching flasks in chilly hands, and watch the sunrise through wisps of steam from our coffee. The river is still and glassy, the only sound that of unseen birds, heralding the morning from the safety of the bushes. Holywell was once part of Fenland, that most mysterious landscape which many once feared due to its wildness, and supposedly untamable inhabitants. In that moment, I could still feel an edge of wildness and mystery to this place, and could easily imagine the stands of swaying reeds that would have once filled this marshy landscape, and the legends of will-o'-the-wisps and lantern men that were once whispered of here.
There has been occupation on this site for a very long time. Certainly Roman artefacts have been found here, and even some flint tools. From the 1086 Domesday Book record, we can see that it's not only the road layout that remains largely unchanged, but also the name of the village. It's recorded in that Latin tome as the village of Holywell, and was a fairly substantial place for the time, with 26 households, 6 smallholders and 1 priest. The name Holywell comes not from a well as you might expect, but from a natural spring, the water from which was thought to have magical healing properties and is understood to have been revered long before Christianity came to these isles. But when come it did, a church was built next to the sacred spring. Historians tell us this first church was already well established by the year of 969 and would have been constructed of wood, wattle and daub. The location of the spring was very fortuitous for the church builders, as the land next to it afforded them a high vantage point with views right across the fens. A prime location also taken advantage of by the Romans who had come before, as there's evidence to suggest that they'd built a lighthouse where the church now stands, which might seem odd given that Holywell is at least 50 miles from the coast, but the neat fields and meadows that stretch out before us now would once have been wild, watery marshes, thick with tangling rushes and sedge, and well known for being treacherous to navigate. Nothing is left of the lighthouse or the Saxon building now, but a medieval stone church takes its place, and the Holy Well remains on the site to this day.
From our position directly in front of the Ferryboat Inn, we look out over the river at a crossing place that was used for centuries and gave the inn its name. Right up until the 1930s, a ferry took people and goods across the Great Ouse from Holywell to the village of Fen Drayton on the other side of the river. It's thought that this crossing point could have been in place as far back as Roman times, a tradition seemingly supported when archaeologists unearthed the remains of a Roman villa in Fen Drayton in recent years. This humble Fenland river crossing was first made famous by Charles Kingsley's 1866 novel Hereward the Wake, in which he wrote of the English folk hero escaping the pursuit of William the Conqueror's men by dashing through the fens, across the Great Ouse by the Holywell ferry, and into the safety of the vast woodland beyond, before finally making it back to his base on the sacred Isle of Ely. The mention of the crossing is brief, but even amidst this chapter of high adventure as the hero flees for freedom, the otherworldly quality of the mysterious Fenland manages to wend its way into the prose.
He looked down over Swaffham Quay and Waterbeach, and the rest of the tree-embowered hamlets which fringed the fen, green knolls on the shore of a boundless sea of pale blue mist, and above that sea, to the far north, a line of darker blue, which was the sacred isle. As the sun sank lower, higher rose the mist, and the isle grew more and more faint, vaporous, dreamy, as fen distances are wont to be. Was it not about to fade away in reality, to become a vapour and a dream, and leave him alone and free?
Truly, it seems this landscape can pluck at something deep within all of us, something that recognises it as a strange and maybe even liminal space. But the story that the inn became famous for in later years concerns the ghost of a girl who predates even Hereward and his exploits rebelling against the Norman occupiers. A ghost who told paranormal investigators that she perished at Holywell in the year 1050.
We found a retelling of the whole story in a newspaper from 1955, a February edition of the Peterborough Citizen Advertiser. In it, they relate the tragic tale of Juliette Tusley, a lovesick girl who lived in Holywell over 900 years ago. Apparently, the fair young maiden fell in love with a dashing, broad-shouldered, curly-haired woodcutter named Thomas Zool, and spent her mornings just hoping to catch a glimpse of him as he passed by on his way to work. One day, her passionate feelings for the man grew so strong that she couldn't bear watching him from the shadows any longer, and had to make her feelings known. She professed her love to him, presenting the woodcutter with a bouquet of flowers alongside her dreams of their happy union. But it seems that Thomas was not interested in courtship at all, and Juliette's hopes were dashed when he roughly brushed her aside and told her to go home to her mother. Her heart broken and her pride in tatters, the stricken girl saw no further future for herself, and taking a rope to one of the willow trees on the riverbank, she took her own life on the 17th of March in the year of 1050. The villagers mourned, but the nature of her passing meant she was forbidden from being buried on hallowed ground. So she was interred at the crossroads near the inn, with just a simple heavy stone slab marking her resting place. Perhaps it was her heartbreak that wouldn't allow her to rest easily in her simple grave. Or perhaps it was the fact that in the following years the ferryboat's trade increased, and so a new wing was built which extended right over the spot where Juliette was buried. Whether in respect for her resting place, or a more pragmatic approach of not wanting to waste perfectly good stone, the inn's owner simply incorporated the grave marker into the floor of the extended inn. But maybe they hadn't bargained for the spectral visitor this would earn them, because local legend says that every year, on the 17th of March, a ghostly white lady will appear, pointing at the flagstone in the floor of the bar. Like most such tales, accounts vary slightly. Some have her appear directly in the bar near the stone. Others have her travel along the riverside towards the pub before reaching the destination of her gravesite. In still others, Thomas actually murdered her, and her unquiet spirit rises from the river at midnight on the anniversary of her death. But whichever version is being told, all accounts seem certain of one thing, that the apparition is that of the lovelorn Juliette.
Juliette's tale is well documented. It's been immortalised amongst the pages of countless ghost guides and anthologies, including by my childhood hero Peter Underwood himself, who told her story in his 1971 Gazetteer of British Ghosts. Landlords, managers and bar staff have all gone on record in newspapers and even on TV, recounting the strange goings-on and how they attribute them all to the ghost of Juliette. As recently as 2019, a former duty manager of the ferryboat, speaking of his experiences in the pub, told the press that the lights just won't go out unless you say, "Good night, Juliette." He declared that he wasn't too spooked by the odd occurrences, but simply tried to remain respectful and remember that it was her building. Within the inn itself, her story is emblazoned across the walls. A restaurant chalkboard tells of the ghost of the ferryboat, framed newspaper clippings about the haunting hang on the walls, and on the oak beam above her gravestone near the bar, the words, "In memory of Juliette Tusley, who died 17th of March 1050 AD, is painted in tall gold lettering. Her story has become so entrenched in local tradition that it even appears on an information board outside on the riverbank, alongside facts about the village name, local wildlife, and the route of a nearby long-distance footpath. It appears in local history articles. We even found it included in a conservation statement produced by the Huntingdonshire Planning Department. In the eyes of the local, as well as the paranormal community, it seems the legend is as good as fact. The only problem is that there never was a Saxon girl named Juliette Tusley in Holywell, or a Thomas Zuhl for that matter. And for all its pervasiveness throughout the years, the origin story of this famous ghost was accidentally fabricated by a group of enthusiastic and well-intentioned paranormal investigators in the series of events that followed their investigation in 1953.
That now famous investigation was led by respected parapsychologist Tony Cornell, member of the Society for Psychical Research and the Ghost Club. He was known for being level-headed and down-to-earth, and for taking care to search for logical explanations before jumping to paranormal conclusions. Which makes it an even stranger twist of fate then, that during his career, he unwittingly became responsible for at least 2 accidental hauntings. One occurred during an appearance on Anglian TV, when he was asked to assess a supposedly haunted property for signs of paranormal happenings. He explained on camera that he had found none, but when the programme was broadcast, the TV station was flooded with phone calls from viewers reporting that even as Cornell was presenting his findings and declaring he'd found no evidence of paranormal activity, they had seen a dark and unexplained apparition appear on screen. The other was the ghost of the Ferryboat Inn. In all fairness, Cornell and his companions were following a real lead. Cornell was a Cambridgeshire local himself and had caught wind of a story in Holywell that a white lady apparition would appear in the pub every year on the 17th of March to point at a flagstone in the floor, which would then become loose in its foundation and could be rocked, even though it was usually quite stable and motionless. Come the night of the 17th of March 1953, Cornell, his girlfriend at the time, and 3 other companions took the opportunity to test the claim, although from what Tony related in later years, despite being curiously hopeful, they were realistic enough to not be expecting to actually see the apparition that night. And they were correct. No white lady appeared for them, although they did find that the big flagstone could indeed be rocked, just as the story said, and they took turns rocking it and inviting the white lady to make her presence known. But as nothing much else was happening, they decided to try and communicate with the ghost through a Ouija board. Now, we're not talking about a properly lettered board with a neat planchette. This was England in the 50s, and such things were not so easy to come by. They simply borrowed a tin tray from the bar, wrote some letters on it, and placed their fingers around the edge of an upturned wine glass. But it just goes to show you don't need a fancy board to get results, as the ghost seemed to be in a chatty mood, and answers started coming through thick and fast. Who are you?
I am Juliette.
Where did you die?
Here.
How did you die?
Hanged.
Why were you hanged?
Because I loved Thomas.
When did you die?
10:50.
Is your grave in this room?
Yes. The group continued their questions until closing time, but they weren't ready to give up their Ouija board session when they were getting such interesting results, so they moved on to other hostelries with later opening hours and continued their investigation. Over the course of the evening, they gathered the following information from the Ouija board: that the spirit they were speaking to was Juliette Tusley, that she had been hanged for loving a woodcutter named Thomas Zuhl in the year 1050, and that her grave was under the flagstone in the bar of the Ferryboat Inn. It was all fascinating, of course, but Cornell was a Cambridge-educated man. He was fully aware of the idiomotor movement, and he knew that prior knowledge of the legend, combined with their eagerness and the group's well-practiced use of Ouija boards in the past, all could have contributed to them finding a story where there was none. But he did his due diligence and looked for records of any family names in the area matching that of Tusley or Zool through history. He found none, and he also found that neither the name Juliette or Thomas were in use during the 11th century. He probably also wondered, as many others did later, how it could be that the ghost of a Saxon girl, whose native tongue would have likely been Old English, could have been conversing with them so fluently using modern English scribbled on a bar tray. In short, Cornell didn't put too much stock in their findings and didn't pretend otherwise. And that might have been an end to it. The ferryboat would have retained its nameless White Lady ghost, whose annual appearance pointing at the bar's flagstone could have, as author Joan Foreman posits in Ghosts of East Anglia, just as easily been meant to indicate treasure buried under the Great Slab as the ghost's own grave. But the landlord of the ferryboat at the time obviously saw an opportunity to increase business. By this time, the famous ferry that had given the inn its name was long gone, and in such a tiny village, it's likely that trade wasn't exactly thriving, so you can hardly blame him for being shrewd. He just might have taken it a little too far. He invited the investigators back for a repeat performance on the next year's anniversary, apparently throwing the offer of a free meal into the mix. Who knows whether the investigators suspected the publican to be using them to draw trade? Maybe they'd already decided to go back anyway and thought they may as well get a free dinner out of it. But I imagine they may not have realised quite how much trade it would draw. The forthcoming event was leaked to the newspapers along with the information that had come through the Ouija board at the first investigation about Juliette and her tragic demise. The press quickly latched on to the story, and news that the Cambridgeshire investigators planned to return to the inn for a repeat performance, supposedly bringing all kinds of whizzy instruments along with them to help them make contact with the resident ghost, spread like wildfire around the area. Of course, the press weren't interested in Cornell's findings that there was no such girl. Juliette was the tragic heroine in a story of heartbreak and sentience beyond death. That alone was too delicious for the papers to pass up, and the fact that it provided a neatly tied-up backstory to the odd flagstone in the pub and its tradition of a female apparition was just the icing on the cake. The pub landlord went before local magistrates to apply for the inn to be granted a special late opening licence so that they could hold their vigil to wait for the ghost's appearance. And, astonishingly, the magistrates granted it.
On the night itself, the Ferryboat Inn was heaving, fit to burst. Every room at the inn was booked up. People were peering in at the windows, and police were turning cars away from the village a mile off. But for all the excitement and expectation, just as last time, Juliette did not appear. So the investigators brought out their not-so-secret weapon, a Ouija board, and not a tin tray this time, but a purpose-made wooden affair. Apparently the planchette flew around the board, but Juliette was not as forthcoming as before. They had a couple of messages that raised everyone's hopes. The first, "I am Juliette," and the second, "I am trying to materialise." Materialise she did not, but then I can't say I blame her. I think that clamouring audience would have been enough to give any spirit stage fright. Of course, the papers were just as vocal about the ghost's non-appearance as they were previously eager in predicting her materialisation, although by their tone, they'd apparently all become much greater sceptics overnight. Headlines such as "Ferryboat Inn's Ghost Vanishes" and "The Ghost That Never Was," alongside quotes from the local reverend stating the whole story was bunkum. On paper, you'd think that between the ghost's non-appearance, The local vicar's claim of the legend being nonsense and the suddenly sceptical tone adopted by the newspapers, as well as Cornell's findings that there was indeed no Juliette Tusley in the historical record, the flash-in-the-pan story would have been relegated to the local paper archives and quickly forgotten. But as we can see, that's not what happened at all. Why did this accidental ghost story not only survive, but flourish, making its way into countless paranormal guides from that day to the present? Well, it was partly down to that very same reverend who was so keen to call it all bunkum. Reverend Alexander George McLennan Pierce Higgins was quite vocal in telling the newspapers that there never was a girl named Juliette in Holywell, and he was right, of course. Only then, he did a very peculiar thing indeed. According to an article by Robert Halliday in the July 2016 issue of Fortean Times, Reverend Higgins wrote a short story using the details from Cornell's Ouija board session, but adding in all sorts of details that fleshed it out into a fully fledged local legend. His story was printed a couple of times. In the first publication, the Reverend revealed at the end that it was all made up, but in the second, he omitted that rather crucial part. What his reasoning for writing this short story was, we can only imagine, especially bearing in mind how he was otherwise so forthright in trying to disprove the legend. Maybe he meant it as a joke, but if so, I think it's safe to say that the joke was on him, because the existence of the legend in the form of a short story only added more fuel to the fire. The press, of course, lapped it up, and Juliette's story started being picked up and retold all across the country, with seemingly more and more details added every time. Suddenly, Juliette wasn't just a name coming through on a makeshift Ouija board, but a happy, fair girl who had a favourite pink dress, was much beloved by village folk, and was always crowned May Queen. Thomas became a broad-shouldered lad with dark curly hair and more of an appetite for a game of ninepins than courting women. Juliette went from being hanged for loving Thomas to taking her own life and consequently being buried at a crossroads rather than in a graveyard. A particularly odd detail, and something which I would have thought would set alarm bells ringing for any locals, as I certainly can't find any evidence the inn was ever near a crossroads. The village is famous for retaining its circular Saxon design, so surely it couldn't have been near a crossroads in 1050 either. It seems that everyone who retold the story took their own liberties with it, which resulted in some very confusing details, such as Juliette being Norman and Thomas being William the Conqueror's head woodcutter, both of which would have been quite some feat, bearing in mind the Normans didn't invade until 16 years after Juliette's supposed demise. In 2003, Tony Cornell took part in a 50th anniversary commemoration of that first investigation at the ferryboat, which was organised by the Ghost Club. In Cornell's obituary in the summer of 2010 Ghost Club Journal, his friend and colleague Alan Murdy writes about how, at the event, Cornell explained the whole mishap to a packed bar made up of Ghost Club members as well as locals. Cornell also wrote about the incident in his 2002 book, Investigating the Paranormal, and yet, despite all this, Juliette's story is still printed in compendiums and gazetteers even to this day. I think my biggest surprise, though, and possibly the reason that so many authors have confidently used the story in their own books, is that Peter Underwood, the godfather of the British Ghost Gazetteer, published it himself, which is very odd, bearing in mind that he and Cornell were contemporaries. They were both members of the Society for Psychical Research and of the Ghost Club. Underwood has often been called the Sherlock Holmes of the paranormal, and many researchers take his work almost as gospel, so this in itself may have contributed to how the story proliferated so readily over the years. But of course none of this means that the Ferryboat Inn isn't haunted. After all, Cornell and friends only went there in the first place chasing a local tradition of a white lady ghost, and many witnesses over the years related strange happenings in the pub that they can't quite explain. Common reports include doors opening and closing by themselves, disembodied footsteps and banging sounds. Items are found in places they shouldn't be, and menus mysteriously appear in the middle of the floor. 2 different inn managers have remarked that dogs dislike the flagstone in the bar, and that they will growl at it, hackles raised, before backing away from the area. For her 1974 book Ghosts of East Anglia, Joan Foreman interviewed a lifelong local of Holywell named Tom Arnold, who related that he had heard the story of the White Lady apparition from his grandparents, and that it was an old legend even in their day. He also had his own strange experience at the inn, although he definitely couldn't blame it on Juliette. One night at the inn, whilst playing cards with the landlord, Tom noticed a door suddenly open behind him, and clearly heard a man's cough for attention. He thought it must be the village policeman who often called in at this hour, but was surprised to see, upon looking in the direction of the cough and open door, that there was nobody there at all. And he wasn't alone in his experience either, as the landlord had also heard the man's cough, but neither of them found any explanation for the odd event. There definitely seemed to be paranormal activity of some kind at the ferryboat, but it troubled us that we couldn't find any record of a single witness actually having seen the female apparition that the inn is so famous for, and it added to our wonder at why Juliette's tale had cast such a strange hold over Holywell. That is, until we visited ourselves.
We first started visiting Holywell a couple of years ago, but of course, during that time the world has been a rather changed place. We've been in and out of lockdowns, and gone are those halcyon days of just nipping carefree to the pub for a drink without a second thought. So we didn't actually go in the old ferryboat itself for a long time. I didn't need to go inside the building though to get the sense that there was something different about the inn, or maybe the river that ran alongside it, or maybe Holywell itself. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But even though I knew that there was no Juliette, I was convinced there was something we were missing, something that Cornell's accidental ghost story didn't explain. Even now, I can't tell you why. It was just a deep feeling that there was more to this story, and I just knew there had to be somebody who had seen the female apparition. Of course, logically, this strange sense of missing something and my slight obsession with the place could simply have been caused by the hours I'd already spent researching Juliette's story. You can easily see how it could have wormed its way into my subconscious. But I've spent just as many hours researching many of the stories we've covered on this show, and none of them have taken hold of me in quite the same way. We became quite regular visitors to the village, parking up on the riverbank, photographing the inn, exploring the area, even exploring the river by kayak. We also tried our radio experiment, during which we use a Gansfield/Estes method style mashup to attempt spirit communication through white noise, despite the fact that, as regular listeners will know, I don't tend to have much luck with it, and it wouldn't exactly provide further evidence anyway. Nevertheless, we both took it in turns to have a go. Fitz, our resident radio experiment talent, heard nothing, which didn't exactly leave me in high hopes. As usual, I heard absolutely nothing through the radio, but I did get the most intense and fully formed image pop into my head of an older woman in a cape or cloak, by the riverside under cover of night, furtively lowering a smallish weighted sack into the river on the end of a rope. It made no sense, and proved nothing, It was an odd experience for me because I'm not in the habit of having technicolor images pop into my head like that. But I knew there were 100 things that could have caused it, and none of them were necessarily paranormal. But it only made me feel like we were missing part of the puzzle. Confused and frustrated, despite all the work and research I'd put into this story, I had all but decided to not tell it after all. And then we decided to visit one last time. With the blazing hot summer we were having and no chance of rain on the horizon for days, if not weeks, we realised that we could visit the inn for that very British of summertime activities, a pub lunch, and eat outside in the spacious pub garden under the pleasant shade of trees looking out across the River Ouse. The good weather would give us the opportunity to don masks and briefly pop into the inn to order, get a peek at the legendary flagstone, and beat a hasty retreat to the refuge of the garden. It felt odd, actually entering the inn after all this time, but it didn't disappoint. The building that stands today is of 17th century construction around what's likely an older core. There are many claims that the inn was mentioned in the 1080 Doomsday Book, and even that there are records showing alcohol was being served on these premises as far back as 560 AD. I wish these were true, but I can't find anything to indicate that they are. There's no mention of any inn in the Great Doomsday Record of Holywell, but then I've never come across any records of alehouses during my searches through the Doomsday Book. It's usually just records of hides, ploughs, villains and abbots in my experience. And although I wouldn't be at all surprised if there was an alehouse on or near the site in the 6th century, because it makes perfect sense to have an ale and a hostelry available at the end of a river crossing, to be honest, I can't find any actual record for it. And I think it's unlikely there would be, being that rather awkward time for historians between the Romans leaving and the Normans invading, when written records just peter off a bit. The nearest I could find was a hint that an inn was recorded here in the early 12th century, which seems reasonable. And really, that's still an incredibly long time ago, and certainly old enough to be the stuff of legend. The ferryboat is everything you could hope a 17th century inn would be. From the pub garden side, the wing of the inn you enter is all whitewashed thatched cottage. Low windows nearly at ground level peek from behind leafy bushes. Ivy creeps up the walls, snaking fingers into the thatch, and hanging baskets under the eaves spill over prettily, with brightly coloured fuchsias and begonias jostling in the breeze amongst ghost-pale white petunias. The door is narrow and low, and even I, a not particularly tall person, have to duck to avoid hitting my head on the low oak lintel, and then again onto more low, rough-hewn beams. It's obviously not an uncommon occurrence for people to fail to negotiate these interesting hazards successfully, as one beam is wrapped in a red velvet-covered cushion, and another is adorned with the sage advice, "Duck!" Once inside, it's clear how much the building has changed over the years. Once upon a time, the inn was two separate buildings, an inn called the Boat, and a cottage that ran the ferry. And at some point they were joined together to create the ferryboat. This and the further expansions and changes across the years are very evident from the interior. The place is a bit of a warren. The floor levels rise and drop, with the area nearest the door dipping well below ground level. There are huge inglenook fireplaces scattered about, one so big it actually has a table and two chairs in it. The building seems to wander off in all directions, with odd little screened-off half-rooms being created by rows of timber uprights that must have originally been part of an outside wall, before one landlord or another decided to tack on an extra wing here and there. And Juliette's story was indeed blazed everywhere. There it was on the chalkboard, and on the oak beam, and there, of course, was the famous flagstone. And I have to admit, it does look odd. Just one lone, darkly weathered and obviously very old, massive flagstone, surrounded by plain wooden floorboards. Of course, I stepped on it. I had to, and I didn't feel anything particularly mystical when I did so, but I recalled the detail about how the stone is said to rock on the 17th of March. I remembered that Cornell and friends were said to have taken turns rocking it, and that the landlady at the time commented that she had only ever known it to be immobile. Standing on it myself, I couldn't see how anyone could have possibly rocked it. It feels absolutely solid and unmovable, and it looks very, very heavy. And then, from my vantage point on top of the flagstone, I peered into a little nook and noticed a yellowed newspaper clipping standing in a frame on a ledge next to one of the fireplaces. I took several hasty pictures of it before losing my nerve at being indoors in a public place, on top of the funny looks I was getting from spending the last 5 minutes staring at a stone on the floor, and retreated to the shade of the trees at the back of the pub garden. It was worth the funny looks though, because scanning through my photos of the article revealed the thing I had been searching for. A witness, an actual eyewitness to the female ghost of the Ferryboat Inn. I was ecstatic, at least to begin with. The 1981 article quoted barman Ian Hogan, who related his strange experience at the inn one morning.
It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and everywhere was very quiet. I had just finished some cleaning and opened a door.
But disaster! The article had obviously gone over 2 pages of the original publication, or there had been something cut out of the middle, and the next line was missing. We pored over it, we tried to track down the original paper, but the clipping simply hadn't been preserved with researchers 40 years into the future in mind. How rude, because we didn't even have the name of the paper to go on, just the date, February 1981. So we can never be sure exactly what Ian Hogan saw that morning, but whatever it was, he was certainly sure that it was the ghost. The remaining print continued.
I held the door open to let her through, and when I turned round again, she was gone. I don't know who else it could have been if it wasn't the ghost.
It was so frustrating to have come this close and be missing that vital line. But I did finally feel like we'd found a missing piece of the puzzle. Somebody had, in fact, seen the female apparition of the ferryboat, and not someone lost to the mists of time either, someone within our generation. Was this what I'd been searching for? What I'd subconsciously been holding out for? Well, I didn't know it then, but there was more to come. Our food arrived and I did my little dance of swapping out the cutlery, coffee mug and straws for my own travel set that I brought with me. It's quite a ride to have OCD these days, I can tell you. But the food was good. It was an extremely rare treat for us to eat out and to have a random day off with no particular schedule. And I was excited to have finally seen all the things in the inn I'd read about for so long, and to have found that article. The sun was scorching, but it was cooler under the shade of the trees than it had been for days in our house. So we relaxed, for once, and watched the boats moored on the river, and admired the quaint higgledy-piggledy inn, looking every bit something out of a classic ghost story, despite the bright summer's day. In fact, I was so relaxed I started thinking about dessert, and hummed and hawed over ice cream before finally deciding that the day merited a treat. Of course, it didn't exactly dissuade me either that it would mean another quick trip to the bar and another chance to take pictures. Back on went the mask, duck under the doorway, under the funny cushioned beam, my eyes swirling colours as they tried to adjust from the blazing sunshine to the soft lighting of the low-ceilinged interior. And as I approached the bar from one direction, an older gentleman approached from the other. Leaning in, he asked the bar staff, "Where's the article about the ghost lady?" I moved to helpfully point the gentleman to the article I'd found near the fireplace just off to my right, but he hadn't quite finished. Because, he continued, I've seen her. At which point I ceased to have any compunction at all about inserting myself unbidden into a conversation with a complete stranger, and all but leapt in front of the poor man, exclaiming, "Have you?" Thankfully, he didn't seem at all fazed by my sudden appearance, and with the bar staff decidedly unmoved by his revelation, he happily related his encounter to me instead. In fact, it didn't take place inside the inn, but on the riverfront, and it adds a whole new dimension to the mystery of this place. It was a good 50 years ago now, he tells me, on a day not too dissimilar to this one, when he and a friend were doing what all youths want to do on a hot summer day like this, and messing about on the river. In their case, they'd managed to cobble together some sort of rickety homemade dinghy and had set off on their grand voyage of the Great Ooze. A little further upstream from the ferryboat, he saw something that looked very out of place on this bright summery day. From his vantage point on the water, he saw a figure on the bank, standing in a sort of arched gateway, a bit like a church lich gate. It was a woman, dressed in a long Victorian dress, floor-length and dark in colour. On her head, she was wearing a little bonnet. He was in no doubt that what he had seen was not just a regular person, and that it was something out of his time. He recalled how clear it was to him, the strange lady in the Victorian dress and bonnet, there one moment under the unforgiving noonday sun, and then gone. I quizzed him as much as I felt I could without turning it into the Spanish Inquisition, and to be fair, he was very gracious as I gawped and exclaimed, all whilst he tried to collect his drinks order and ferry a tray back to his waiting family. He gave me a good idea of where he'd seen the apparition, so as soon as we'd finished eating and packed up, I set about looking for the gate. To be honest though, it wasn't the day for it. Whilst it was very pleasant in the cool shade of the tree-lined garden, by the time we were leaving it was the hottest part of the day, and anything in direct sunlight was basically an inferno. There was no shade to be had on the footpaths by the riverbank, so I scouted up and down as quickly as I could, but it didn't take long for the footpath to move away from the river, meaning I couldn't explore the area he would have seen by boat. We had no choice but to head for home and batten down the hatches against the coming heatwave. Later, we consulted my beloved maps, along with a bit of Google Earth and photos we'd taken on our earlier visits to help us in our quest to find the mysterious arched gateway. Our witness was sure he'd seen the apparition just upriver of the inn towards the church. On the map, this doesn't look very likely, as almost immediately past the inn on the upstream side, the river starts swinging away from the village, leaving a wide stretch of fields between the ooze and anywhere likely to have a gateway such as the one he described. Having paddled in that direction myself on a previous exploration by kayak, I couldn't remember seeing anything on that side of the bank at all, edged as it was by thick swathes of tall rushes and overhanging willows, and I was certain I'd made it beyond the point he described. But then I remembered that when I'd first put the kayak in at the slipway opposite the inn's garden, I tried to paddle up a narrower river channel rather than immediately head downstream and straight into the main wide channel where I would have had to negotiate mooring motorboats. It was a good plan, but I didn't get very far. The channel was extremely overgrown and obviously wasn't kept clear. With the incredibly dry season we'd been having, the water levels were low and the foliage had become rampant. Trees on either side of the bank had grown so far over the water that they almost met in the middle. I soon got into a traffic jam standoff with a family of ducks and had to use my spare short paddle to punt myself out backwards. But looking at the map later, we could see that this small backwater channel didn't follow the main river, and instead hugged close to the edge of the village, running right by the church. What's more, employing the powers of Google Street View showed us that just as the road curves up past the church, a gate in a short stretch of fenced-off grass opens onto a footpath leading directly to a footbridge over this river channel. It's not an arched gateway these days, but half a century ago, it could well have been. And location-wise, it fit. Even from the Google Earth picture, we could see that there was a clear view to this gate from the water. Of course, 50 years ago, the conditions could have been very different, and in more typical British weather, that channel would likely have been less overgrown and with deeper water, more than likely enough to make it navigable for two young lads in a homemade dinghy. With these revelations, I finally felt the spell of the Ferryboat Inn loosening its grip on me. For the last 2 years, it had held me in a fervour of believing, for no real reason that I could fathom, that there had to be more to the stories than a Ouija board experiment colliding with a conflicted reverend. And it turned out that there was. But who was the ghost then? Was the Victorian lady on the riverbank the same apparition that Ian Hogan had encountered in 1981? Were either of these women related to the White Lady stories of old? Did Cornell and gang communicate with the restless spirit of the ferryboat through their makeshift Ouija board after all? And who is causing the continuing, unexplained events at the inn up to this very day? Why do the lights only turn off after staff say "Good night, Juliette" when there is no Juliette? Or is it possible that after decades of so many people believing fervently in Juliette's story, that their collective thoughts have actually manifested her ghost at the inn? Sadly, to these questions, we may never find answers, and I'll have to be satisfied with the fact that after all of the doubt cast on the haunting of Holywell by the confusing tale of Juliette, it turns out that there was some substance to the ghost stories after all, just not quite in the way we might have expected. Still poring over my maps and Google Street View, as I'm often wont to do, I felt an almost satisfying little jolt to realise one last thing about the location we'd narrowed down for our witness's riverside sighting. It turns out to be practically opposite the ancient holy well from whence the village got its name. These days, it certainly looks more like a well than a spring, with a neat little stone archway over it and an iron gate across the front. It looks a bit utilitarian in a Victorian sort of way, but it hasn't been forgotten by the locals. The very first time we ever visited Holywell, we, completely by accident, managed to time it to coincide with the village well-dressing festival, during which the spring, church and grounds are decorated with flowers in celebration. We would have had no idea this even took place had we not unwittingly stumbled into it. But I felt privileged to have done so, and have been, even unintentionally, part of an age-old celebration. If historians are correct, and this spring has been held sacred since before Roman times, who knew how many countless centuries something similar to the well-dressing celebration had been taking place? And seeing it appear now, at the end of this long and winding 2-year journey, at the place where we believe our witness had his encounter, I feel like I've come full circle. Did this one constant, this common thread of reverence stretching back through time and binding together people spanning different eons and very different faiths, bring the past just a little bit closer to the surface at this place? Between this and the quite individual propensity of the fenland landscape for myths, legends, and apparently ghosts to take root here and hold fast, unmoved by the shifting sands of time, it doesn't feel so strange anymore that Juliette's story lives on against all odds. But if you ever do have a chance to visit Holywell, once you've had your fill of the quaint thatched inn, with its crooked beams, whitewashed chimney pots, and stories of a lovelorn Saxon girl. Make sure to take a quiet wander along the river. Visit the ancient spring knelt at by generation upon generations of souls past. And as you look out across the river and the fields beyond, imagine the wild, marshy fenland that Hereward would have known here, and wonder at what other secrets, ghosts and legends this landscape still hold for us to find.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Not Once for Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, and remember that if you've had a paranormal experience, we would love to hear about it, and you can share it with us over at our website, notonceforyes.com. A huge thank you to our patrons, KOFY and Repod supporters, without whom we wouldn't be able to do what we do. We'll be having our next supporter Zoom chat soon, and this time, along with the chat, we'll be talking about some of the strange experiments of parapsychologist Tony Cornell that we just couldn't fit into this episode. So keep an eye out for that, and hopefully we'll catch up with you all soon. And don't forget to keep an ear out in case Jack decides to pop in again. Not Once for Yes is produced by my production company Narrative Audio, and if you have a podcast and would like to outsource your editing and post-production, then please do get in touch either through Not Once for Yes or narrativeaudio.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you will join us again for some more spooky stories and haunted history on the next Not Once for Yes.